Welcome to some very famous people you've never really heard of. Bite-sized biographies of the famous, the infamous, and the quirky in less than an hour. My name is Philip D. Gibbons, and there is more information about me, this podcast, and a bibliography at someveryfamouspeople.com. There are also photographs of many of the individuals and items mentioned in this podcast. At the conclusion of Part 2 of this presentation, there will be additional suggestions concerning further information about today's subject, Frank Morris, John and Clarence Anglin, and the true story of their remarkable escape from Alcatraz. Now let's continue with our story about escape from Alcatraz. To begin their lengthy effort, one at a time, the four conspirators stole spoons from the prison dining room. Once the spoon part was removed, the shaft of the utensil could be sharpened. West was the first of the four to try and attempt to use this improvised tool on the small rectangular rear ventilation grate at the rear of his cell. Although recently converted to fresh water, for many years the plumbing within the prison utilized salt water from the bay. This corroded the pipes and just about every surface that this water touched, eventually leaking into the concrete walls, weakening and loosening this infrastructure. West planned to try and jab small holes around the vent, plugging these up with soap and toilet tissue to conceal them until he was able to remove the grate and widen the hole, allowing access into the utility corridor. From there, the four intended to climb up the large cast iron plumbing pipes to the top of the cell block and the vents on the roof. West waited until after dinner and the time period known as happy hour, in which prisoners were allowed to play musical instruments and generally blow off steam for an hour until they settled in, with lights out at 9:30. With Morris using a tiny mirror to spot any guards approaching their cells, West began to scratch circular holes in the back of his cell wall. If warned, he quickly put a towel over the area and hopped into his bunk. By the time any guard walked by, he appeared to be harmlessly leafing through a magazine. Although laborious, West immediately sensed that this method could eventually succeed. He conveyed this message to the rest of his conspirators over breakfast the next day. Incorporating the whole method, each of the potential escapees started hacking away at the edges of their own ventilation ducts and enjoyed similar success. They employed the lookout tactic of one individual keeping an eye out for guards while the other chipped away in the adjacent cell, switching up to allow equal time for each prisoner. Coincidentally, both Popular Mechanics and Sports Illustrated published articles concerning both life preserver and life raft design. Both publications were reviewed by West especially, responsible for the design and construction of life preservers, a process running concurrently with the attempt to punch holes into the cell walls. The Anglins were charged with producing lifelike heads meant to be placed behind on the prisoners' cots, not only during any potential escape, but during any time period when the convicts entered the utility corridor, reconnoitering the roof area and the vent they believed they could access. It seems clear, in retrospect, that the escape team had help from other prisoners in their efforts to produce these items. The Anglin's first effort was a small, half-sized head with indistinct features and hair haphazardly glued to its upper portion. Based on how the guards handled their count procedure during the lights-out portion of the schedule, this was sufficient. Over time, rather than shining their flashlights directly into a cell and the face of an inmate, the guards compromised by shining their light on the ceiling of the cell so as not to disturb and wake up prisoners who would not appreciate such an intrusion every few hours. Although prisoners were required to sleep with their head positioned toward the front of the cell and their legs pointed toward the rear, a guard seeing anything remotely looking like a prisoner's head would move on. This process gotten cursory over time, the guards believing that any escape attempt, no matter how rare, would not originate directly from a cell in the middle of the night. But subsequent dummy heads were much more sophisticated, with additional features. more realistic skin tones, styled hair, and much more lifelike ears, nose, and mouth, molded with plaster and adorned with realistic shades of paint. Although several sketches sent to them from Alcatraz were later produced by the Anglin family to indicate that the two brothers were gifted artists, it is believed that other much more artistically talented prisoners with access to industry's building supplies were responsible for the sketches and the 3 additional dummy heads. By early 1962, there were several other general issues responsible for decreasing vigilance on the part of the correctional staff. The Bureau of Prisons, aware of the deteriorating infrastructure conditions at Alcatraz, commissioned a formal analysis of the potential cost of modernizing the institution. Such a process was budgeted at $4 million, a significant number at the time. Another federal maximum security prison was already under construction in Marion, Illinois, a much more central geographic location that would not require the expense of transporting most inmates to a West Coast location. With the completion of this new facility, expected in 1963, upper-level officials at Alcatraz were all but officially told that the prison was to be closed, a victim of cost, decay, and lack of efficiency. It did not take long for this information to filter down through the ranks. Despite the comparatively stressful demands of the job itself, most correctional officers liked living in the Bay Area and had no desire to relocate to some rural enclave in southern Illinois. Many began to seek employment elsewhere. Budget cuts also meant less manpower actually protecting the facility itself. By the early 60s, only one guard tower was manned 24/7. 2 other towers were only manned during work hours and not at night, a critical factor that the West Morris Anglin crew would exploit. Cutbacks and an uncertain future essentially contributed to a general malaise among staff, the oppressive, austere approach of the 30s and 40s having subsided. By late April, the 4 conspirators had made so much progress on puncturing their rear cell walls that a new problem arose. As they picked away at the cement, the square metal grill of the ventilation duct itself remained. Corroded and weakened after decades in place, these grills could be dislodged with well-placed kicks. The group had already figured out how to disguise their destruction of the vents from any guard looking into their cell from the front. They merely took paper, razored out a diamond-shaped design that resembled the vent, glued it onto a scavenged cigar box or other container, and placed it in the opening, surrounded by fitted white canvas board that made the wall look pristine. But once the men broke through the wall, their handiwork would be visible on the other side, the guards also frequently examining the utility corridor internally for any signs of this kind of endeavor. On April 25th, John Anglin was the first of the 4 to actually widen the aperture at the back of his cell, allowing him to access the utility corridor. He did anticipate the need to disguise this breakthrough on the utility corridor side, fashioning a similar detachable box with painted grid design that fit into the opening. He also slapped some minimal stolen cement solution around the hole to cover any obvious damage. Because the guards' examination of the utility corridor was even more perfunctory than their nightly rounds, this attempt at concealment was sufficient. A few days after John Anglin broke through, Clarence convinced him to allow them to switch cells during happy hour so he could crawl up to the top of the cell block. After leaving the small dummy head behind, laboriously he picked his way to the top, carefully holding on to the pipes of the utility corridor. He could possibly slip and fall several stories, a drop that would not only be fatal, but also end the possibility of any escape. When he reached the daytime work area assembled by West, he spent most of his time looking at the air vent that they believed was their avenue out of the prison. He had brought a screwdriver, but realized immediately that the outer barriers on the duct were attached with 6-sided sheet metal screws, as opposed to the more typically grooved connectors. He returned to his brother's cell, the guards not even noticing the switch. The next morning, the 2 men would switch back after a breakfast, highlighted by Clarence telling the rest of them what he had observed. West wasn't as intent on busting through the back of his cell just yet because he had access to the roof as his designated work area. While supposedly cleaning in preparation for painting the ceiling, he then implemented an especially ingenious manipulation of the correctional staff involving an attempt to put blankets up, screening any visual access to what he was actually doing. Although it was etched in stone that all prisoners in any work detail were to be supervised, the direct supervision in West's case frequently just locked him in the utility corridor and checked up on him occasionally. West then began sweeping dirt and dust from the top of the cell block in a manner that brought complaints from inmates below. He then casually suggested to the CO in charge that he could put up blankets and keep the dust and dirt in a contained area. He added that he could get the painting done a lot faster, an inducement to the supervising lieutenant to agree to what was a rather inappropriate bending of the rules. Eventually, the captain of the guards, Thomas Bradley, got involved and agreed to the blanket solution, perhaps not really understanding what this entailed. Even craftier, once West got the agreement, knowing that John Anglin worked in the clothing room, he had him wait until the regular lieutenant in charge of his area's day off, and then had dozens of blankets sent over. By the time the lieutenant returned from his break, approximately 30 blankets were obscuring the relevant area. Once they were up, nobody questioned their presence. If the captain of the guards had agreed, then they certainly weren't going to object to him personally. The blanket screen allowed the cons to quicken the pace. During the day, West brought up all sorts of contraband, including glue, rope, and gloves. At night, the Anglins brought up the raft parts and a concertina that Morris had specially ordered, played during happy hour to obscure the sounds of the others scraping away in their cells. He then modified it to potentially use as a bellows to inflate the raft and life preservers. Once Morris broke through the back of his cell, he and Clarence Anglin spent another happy hour in the vicinity of the duct. With a stolen wrench, Morris climbed up near the duct and was able to loosen and then remove the screws on the outer duct cover. He handed this down to Anglin and took a look inside. He was encouraged by the sensation of a breeze coming through the large pipe, but then observed that there was still a twin-barred obstruction inside the duct. It was also dark, and try as he might, Morris was not able to get a very good look inside. The loud bell signaling the end of happy hour sounded, and Morris quickly replaced the outer duct, leaving the screws loose, but not visibly disturbed, and both men rapidly made their way back to their cells. If rumors of something going on involving an impending escape were not prevalent before this time period, certainly much of the cell block couldn't fail to hear something going on in the utility corridor. This only hastened the group's determination to try and break out as quickly as possible, as it was only a matter of time before some other prisoner would risk the consequences and rat them out. That or the scale of the operation becoming too large to evade official detection. This urgency was underlined by Morris rigging up a crude battery-powered light from materials scavenged in the Industries building in time to head back to the duct area the next night. What he initially saw in the duct were two thin metal rods, easily bent by a bar spreader, a tool easily acquired in any prison in America. A pipe would be fitted with a bolt and a screw. Then this contraption would be tightly lodged in between any bar, or in this case rod, that needed to be bent. Then the screw would be expanded with a wrench, this expansion forcibly bending the rod until it allowed an opening big enough for the crew to slip through. It took 3 nights of Morris working on one of the rods to finally sufficiently bend it. Once past that impediment, Morris then discovered that at the top of the vent shaft was a circular barred iron grate, anchored into the sheet metal duct by 6 legs spread equally apart, attached with 2 rivets on each leg. It would take weeks to get by this last barrier. Even an improvised drill using a stolen vacuum cleaner motor would not budge the rivets. Finally, Morris determined that jamming a screwdriver underneath the head of each rivet would allow him to saw the rivet off with a hacksaw. But with only a very awkward access to this work area in the duct, this took nights of demanding and tedious effort. The Anglins would be present, either working on the raft or assisting Morris, but the tension of the situation eventually got to all of the conspirators, especially when Morris observed that the Anglins had changed the design of the raft from a square configuration to a triangle. On several occasions, Morris almost came to blows with each of the brothers, his simmering hostility over their big mouths and braggart ways bubbling over. His attitude was influenced by West, who flat out distrusted the Anglins, but both men realized that they were stuck with them, and it was best to just ignore their differences. They could always split up after a successful escape. Finally, on June 11th, at 4 o'clock in the morning, Morris had loosened or removed both the grate and the modestly attached duct covers that were the last impediments to getting out on the roof. He also was able to use a crude periscope to assess how well lit the roof was and a possible path to get off the roof and down the 40-foot pipe that led from the prison bakery to the ground. The plan was then to head to the northwest part of the island, positioning the escapees in the proper orientation to Angel Island. The prisoners were able to stay out of their cells for much of the night, now confident that the dummy heads would defy the nightly bed check counts, the guards again only adopting a perfunctory attitude. At breakfast, all four men agreed that they would escape that evening, West having finished the fourth and final life preserver. He still had not broken out enough cement to allow access to the utility corridor, but believed that he could easily make that happen when the time came. But at about 9:30 p.m., with the breakout imminent, West suddenly determined that he couldn't dislodge enough cement to get out into the corridor. When Clarence Anglin came down from the roof to determine where West was, the panicking convict told him he couldn't get out and needed help. Anglin told him he would go get Morris and quickly climb back to the roof area. Morris did return with a piece of pipe and encouraged West to keep trying, West insisting that he return with both Anglins to help dislodge enough cement to get him out of his cell. Morris told him to calm down and then said he would come back in a few minutes. It is not known what, if any, thought process went into the decisions the three convicts made with regard to what to do next. Whether they collectively agreed to leave West behind, or Morris's suspicion that if he left the Anglins and returned down below, they would leave with the raft, making his chances of swimming anywhere with a mere life preserver a long shot. What is known is that within minutes, Morris loosened the screws of the duct cover, initiating the final steps of the escape. West was on his own. Whether it was karma or just the bad luck of working in such a confined area, as he was loosening the duct cover hood, a bulky, heavy contraption, an omnipresent gust of wind tore it out of his hand and sent it landing a few feet away on the top of the roof. Prisoners, especially in B Block, had heard the sounds of Morris and the Anglins climbing up to the roof, their occasional whispered arguments also audible to nearby cells. But this noise was something different, a loud bang that resonated throughout the entire cell block. Even worse, the hundreds of seagulls who had over time replaced the pelicans of yesteryear began to alight, screaming and circling loudly, an indication of some disturbing presence. Later, other convicts, at least vaguely aware that an escape attempt was imminent, would say that at that point they figured that such an effort couldn't possibly succeed and that the alarm signaling a prison lockdown was imminent. But no such alarm came. Instead, having heard the initial bang, the presiding lieutenant, having heard reports of a sound in the hospital area, went to that location and focused his attention on this interior part of the prison, as opposed to the roof directly above this location. He remained there for at least a half hour, did not order a patrol of the island's exterior, and did not invoke an emergency count in which each prisoner would have to stand in their cells and be counted. The three convicts quickly emerged from the duct and scurried along the rooftop, careful to keep low, and were quickly by the edge of the cell block roof. Morris was the first to shimmy down to the ground, getting there in about a minute. The noise from the seagulls only increased in intensity. Although secure enough to support the escapees, the bakery exhaust pipe did bang against the wall of the cell block as John Anglin made his way down. That noise resounded loudly throughout the prison, but again any supervision focused on the interior area of the hospital, not even considering that anyone could make it to the prison's exterior. At this point in the escape, all three convicts were greatly aided by the lack of any personnel in the nearest watchtower, the escapees passing directly through that area on their way to the shoreline. The most serious barrier left was a 14-foot-high fence they climbed, a short bucket brigade getting their requisite gear up and over the fence. By 11 p.m., it is believed that the three men were at the water's edge, on the northern portion of the island, where they used their concertina to inflate the raft. What happened next remains a matter of conjecture, one of the great popular culture mysteries of the 20th century. Allen West later claimed that he did finally extricate himself from his cell at about 1:45 a.m. Hurrying to the roof area, he discovered the last life preserver left for him, but no trace of the other three. He claimed that he then hoisted himself up through the duct and made his way to the bakery pipe area, hoping to see some trace of his co-conspirators. Seeing nothing, and figuring that they were long gone, he then returned to his cell, whispering to any other inmates that he had been left behind. There was nothing else he could do but wait until the 7 a.m. morning wake-up alarm bell. Later, several convicts and even correctional officers opined that they thought West had actually chickened out, using the cement situation as an excuse to get out of actually attempting what would be a very difficult escape. When the bell went off, much of the inmate population waited with anticipation, wondering if the noise and commotion of the previous night resulted in anything substantive. Many prisoners were aware that the group was up to something, but unaware of exactly when they might attempt an escape. Lawrence Bartlett was the correctional officer in charge of the morning count of prisoners in Cell Block B. At first, this Tuesday seemed like just another ordinary day until he got to the cell of Clarence Anglin. Upon the sounding of the alarm bell, prisoners were to awake and begin preparing to enter the mess hall for breakfast. But Anglin still appeared to be sleeping or unconscious, his head just a few feet from Bartlett, blankets folded to make it appear as if his body was underneath the bed's covers. Anglin's dummy head was so convincing, and the guards so discounting any possibility that the prisoner could be anywhere but in his cell, that even after the guard tried unsuccessfully to wake up the stationary prisoner, Bartlett quickly headed off to confer with his supervising lieutenant, William Long. Irritated upon hearing of the situation, Long groused that he would certainly make Anglin get up and quickly. Shouting through the bars unsuccessfully, he then reached in and slapped what he thought was the convict's head, but the prosthetic merely rolled off of the pillow and plopped onto the floor. Long, initially stunned, wasn't sure what to make of this until the cell was opened and other officers informed him of two other similarly empty cells in the vicinity. Allen West immediately got this group's attention by showing them his fake grill and telling them that he planned the escape. West was removed from his cell for questioning, and Long quickly phoned the prison command center. The warden, Olin Blackwell, was actually off-site on vacation, although this may have been coincidental. The acting warden, Art Dollison, was notified. The escape siren sounded, and the roof exit point for the escapees was also quickly discovered. The life jacket left for West, as well as a makeshift wooden paddle dropped along a prison walkway, were located. These would prove to be crucial discoveries over the course of the next few days. Because the soot on the roof left footprints that were easily observable, it was possible to track the exact path that the escapees followed towards the water. They also at times traversed tall grass, this foliage visibly disturbed in a way that provided additional information about exactly where the trio accessed the shoreline. A pile of discarded electrical wiring found only a few feet from the water on the northern side of the island indicated the exact spot where the three men at least attempted to access the water. But despite an intensive search of the prison and its exterior grounds, it was clear that Morris and the two Anglins had, at the very least, successfully escaped from the penitentiary and at least made it into the bay. As this information spread through the inmate population, the prisoners were jubilant. They thoroughly enjoyed the notion that the myth of the rock as inescapable was permanently broken, the story receiving national attention. As for the prison staff, from the warden on down, the escape was an embarrassing and humiliating failure, especially when even a cursory investigation revealed the scope of the prisoners' process and their ability to carry out such an audacious plan for many months, even years, without detection. Within days, the FBI had launched both a thorough internal investigation of the events within the prison, as well as an extensive regional attempt to survey the immediate San Francisco Bay Area in an effort to locate either the prisoners or any debris associated with the escape. This search involved the Army and the Coast Guard, who provided manpower and maritime equipment. As Angel Island was at the time a military installation, personnel thoroughly searched the area for any trace of the escapees. The FBI immediately began to interview prisoners, especially those they felt had personally aided the escapees. But this was a predictably fruitless endeavor, as each of the prisoners denied involvement and claimed to know nothing about the incident. It would not take long for this intensive search to turn up items ultimately connected to the escape. As early as the night of June 12th at 10:15 p.m., a crude paddle was found floating off of Angel Island. Much like the paddle the trio dropped as they were rapidly trying to get to the shoreline. On Thursday, a small reinforced waterproof bag constructed of raincoat material was found between Alcatraz and Angel Islands, picked out of the water by an Army debris skimmer. This container was filled with handwritten pages of names and addresses, obviously a potential list of contacts, numerous photographs of members of the Anglin family, as well as a letter addressed to Clarence Anglin. On Friday, June 15th, a handmade life jacket was retrieved by two civilians off of Fort Cronkite Beach. These individuals, having heard of the prison escape as a result of the massive Bay Area publicity, drove the article to the Sausalito police station. Eventually, it was forwarded to the FBI. On June 22nd, 11 days after the escape, another life jacket was retrieved from the water approximately 50 yards off of the east side of Alcatraz itself. This life jacket was the last physical item connected to the escape that was ever found. However, that fall, two merchant seamen aboard a Norwegian ship reported that they had spotted a body in the water about 4 weeks after the escape. This body was observed about 20 miles north of the Golden Gate, and because they did not wish to spend the time either recovering the corpse or returning to San Francisco to turn it in, they kept sailing. They did inform port personnel upon their return to the Bay Area and were interviewed by the FBI, but this was not until October 18th, 1962, of little other than anecdotal value, the body unrecoverable at that point. So, over 60 years after one of the most spectacular prison escapes in U.S. history, the question remains, did these three men successfully make it to land and freedom? The most compelling evidence that the three did make it was that their bodies and the raft were never found. But the unique properties of the San Francisco Bay make this fundamental, at best, problematic. In fact, from 1960 until 1962, of the 42 people who committed suicide jumping off of the Golden Gate Bridge, only 17 bodies were recovered. In fact, an individual named Seymour Webb jumped off the bridge on the same day as the three convicts attempted their escape, June 11, 1962. His body was never found. Even today, despite much greater awareness of the number of people who jump off of the Golden Gate Bridge, the Coast Guard still only recovers a body about half of the time. Tidal conditions and the timing of the escape also indicate that the convicts faced a formidable obstacle in trying to reach Angel Island. High tide at Alcatraz on June 11th was at about 8 p.m. The three men would have attempted to enter the water at about 11 p.m. At this time, the tide would be receding, the massive amount of water in the bay sweeping its way towards the Golden Gate and away from Angel Island. Even with paddles in their flimsy raft, getting to Angel Island seems tenuous at best. But perhaps the trio gave up and just went with the current and were fortunate enough to reach land in some western area of the harbor. This also seems unlikely, as Alan West outlined that their plans called for the escapees, once they hit land, to burgle a clothing store. steal a car, and get out of the San Francisco area as quickly as possible. In an era where such behavior would have been far more noticeable, no such crimes were documented. No break-ins or car thefts, as far as law enforcement could accurately determine. Because of the exterior temperature in the high 40s, it is likely that the three men kept their heavy Navy pea coats on during the escape. They also might have kept on their shoes as they attempted to enter and navigate their life raft. Either article of clothing would have been problematic if the raft started to sink, especially the pea coats, which would have become extremely heavy. Both of the recovered life vests were missing the clamp on the attached improvised tube used to inflate this mechanism. The tube was then closed with the strong clamp meant to seal the device, maintaining inflation for as long as possible. On top of the missing clamps, there were teeth marks on one of the tubes, indicating that its user tried to maintain inflation by biting down on the aperture for as long as possible. This indicates that at some point the escapees wound up in the water, clearly not a good sign. The location of the life preserver, found outside of the Golden Gate, conforms exactly to what would have happened to any object swept out to sea and then returned to the shore in a subsequent rising tide. Over time, any of the convicts familiar with Morris and the Anglins came to a more streetwise realistic conclusion. Here were three men from poor backgrounds who were habitual criminals and virtually unemployable. Even their own escape plan called for them to reoffend within minutes of leaving the prison. Would they really be able to escape a national manhunt, avoid contacting their own relatives, and be able to support themselves without getting rearrested, especially considering that the Anglins were notorious braggarts that would not have been able to resist discussing pulling off one of the greatest escapes in U.S. history? They came to the same conclusion that the FBI reached unofficially, that at some point the three men wound up drowning in San Francisco Bay and their bodies were swept out to sea. Although the FBI never came to that conclusion officially, for many years classifying the three men as missing, and despite several generations of Anglins claiming to have secretly spent time with the brothers, an alleged photograph taken years later in Brazil, and even tales of the Anglins dressing as women and surreptitiously attending their mother's 1973 funeral, their parents seemed to adopt a much more realistic attitude, in 1970 beginning the legal process of officially declaring their missing sons as deceased. If the overall inefficiency of Alcatraz and the June 11, 1962 escape didn't thoroughly seal the fate of the institution, another incident on December 16, 1962, only reinforced federal intent to shut the facility down. On this cloudy, rainy Sunday afternoon, two bank robbers serving lengthy sentences, John Paul Scott and Darrell D. Parker, sawed through the bars of a window in the Alcatraz kitchen basement. Having inflated surgical gloves and placed them underneath their shirt sleeves as flotation devices, Scott and Parker then attempted to swim to the mainland. Parker only got as far as a rock formation about 100 yards offshore known as Little Alcatraz, where he was picked up by prison patrol boat. He was immediately returned to custody. Scott would actually wash up on Fort Point, the southern tip of land at the Golden Gate. Naked except for his socks, he was spotted on the rocks in great distress and possibly unconscious by some juveniles who reported his presence to the Presidio Park police. He was rushed to nearby Letterman Hospital, where he was treated for potentially fatal hypothermia, having also sustained bruising and cuts. Scott was eventually stabilized and transported back to Alcatraz, where he spent a night in the prison hospital before being locked in solitary confinement. He told prison authorities that he was so numb and disoriented by the time he reached the Golden Gate that he could not even distinguish the mainland and believed that he was about to drown. It is interesting to note that the escape attempt began at about 5:30 p.m., and when Scott was located on the rocks by the Golden Gate Bridge at about 7:30 p.m., he had already traveled a distance of approximately 5 miles, a testament to the strength of the bay's current. Scott is the only man ever to escape from Alcatraz and positively make it to the mainland, albeit practically dying in the process. Scott spent most of the rest of his life in federal prisons, dying in 1987 at FCI Tallahassee. On January 11, 1964, Alfred Anglin was electrocuted while attempting to escape from a state prison at Kilby, Alabama. Anglin had already served his federal time for the Columbia, Alabama bank robbery committed with his two brothers and was serving the Alabama state time conviction. This escape attempt was perplexing to both the Anglin family and even prison authorities, as Alfred had been completely cooperative, was already being given potential parole dates, and seemed happy to be out of the federal correction system. For years, the Anglin family wondered about some sort of conspiracy to mistreat Alfred, to elicit information about the whereabouts of his two brothers. It would take decades, but in 2015, Alfred Anglin's body was eventually exhumed to provide DNA material to compare with an incomplete set of bones that were found along the Point Reyes National Seashore in February of 1964. Following an autopsy that indicated that Alfred Anglin had died of electrocution with no evidence of torture or mistreatment, DNA extracted proved that the skeletal remains from Point Reyes were not from the Anglins, and a DNA comparison also ruled out Morris. Allen West was paroled in 1967 and was free for about a year until his arrest in Florida for grand larceny and robbery. He was given several sentences, including life, all to run concurrently. In October of 1972, West stabbed another prisoner to death and was handed additional time. He died in a prison hospital, also in Tallahassee, Florida, on December 21, 1978, of peritonitis, possibly contracted in another prison stabbing incident. Alcatraz was permanently closed in 1963. The inmates gradually transferred to other federal institutions, the final contingent leaving on March 21st. Today, it is an historical site administered by the National Park Service. Initially, the federal prison at Marion, Illinois, served as the federal prison system's major maximum security facility for escape threats or incorrigible inmates. The institution retained the status until the October 1983 coordinated murders of two correctional officers by members of the Aryan Brotherhood. This incident prompted the Bureau of Prisons to construct an even more restrictive and austere facility at Florence, Colorado, which opened in 1993. It currently houses such notorious individuals as Boston Marathon bomber Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, Oklahoma City bomber Terry Nichols, 9/11 conspirator Zacarias Moussaoui, shoe bomber Richard Reed, Mexican cartel leader Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, and many other individuals considered either extremely dangerous or high-security risks. Considered escape-proof, within the federal prison system, it is referred to as Supermax and nicknamed the Alcatraz of the Rockies. Thank you for listening to part 2 of this podcast about the escape from Alcatraz. Information for this podcast came from the books Escaping Alcatraz by Michael Esslinger and Breaking the Rock by Jolene Babyak. There are also additional photographs, bibliographical, and musical information at someveryfamouspeople.com. If you have enjoyed this presentation, please like us at our Facebook page, Some Very Famous People, and follow us on Twitter at Philip D. Gibbons. Subscribe to my YouTube page at Noblesse Oblige. Please note that all of Bite-Sized Biographies are now available on YouTube and YouTube Music. And please tell a friend about Bite-Sized Biographies.